So, busy man.
So, yeah, this was a lot better.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
I didn't get through the whole thing, but...
Well, I did.
Good.
Well, I
Good
got
job.
through what we said we would get through, right?
What did we say we would get through?
We weren't doing the whole thing. We were doing up to chapter 9.
Oh, okay. No, I didn't.
Chapter 9.
I got through property.
Okay, well that's good. But yeah, do you remember? Because we were going to split it in half, and then we'll do chapter 9.
I do remember
on
that.
for
I
the
just
last
didn't
one.
remember what our points were.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's all good. Although I would, I almost was hoping that you'd get through at least to chapter 7 and 8, because he talks about a lot of, I feel like, he actually articulates a lot of points I feel like you were trying to articulate to me, at least, during the Anarchy
Oh,
episodes.
nice. Okay, yeah.
But we should say, so yeah, we're doing John Locke again, and we're doing the second treatise, the first half of the second treatise, and then we'll do the second half next time.
Nice. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, state of nature, man.
Oh yeah, yeah. Actually, so there's all this state of nature stuff. It's interesting how he builds it, starting from the state of nature, because Ayn Rand does the same thing. I felt like I was reading Ayn Rand again, actually.
Really? Mm-hmm. So she's just a ripoff.
Yeah, maybe. Unless he's ripping her off.
Yeah, that's probably how.
Yeah,
it is.
we shouldn't be misogynistic about it.
That's true. Yeah, no, well, I mean, to be fair, also, I think a lot of people approach it from that because it makes sense. It's like you're trying to think, what's the best thing? Because essentially what he's talking about in these treatises is how political society was established, and then also what an ideal political society would look like.
Right.
And so it makes sense that you would start from the bare bones. I mean, Socrates does, Plato in the Republic, they kind of do this too.
But what I appreciate about John Locke in this is several times he just makes abundantly clear what his thought is, what he thinks the situation should be.
Right.
I think X, and I go, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
No, it's true. It's true. Yeah, we're having a little bit of Zoom stuff. I'm wondering if it's probably my internet.
Okay, sure.
But I think we're good.
Yeah.
I think if we just ignore it, I mean, the audio on our end should be fine,
If your audio cuts out, I'll just agree with what you're saying. I'll go, yeah, that
exactly.
sounds right.
Yeah. Antushka's an idiot, right? Oh.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I guess if you want to start, I don't know, should we summarize it or should we start with some of his definitions? I
kind of think maybe we could go through the chapters, because each chapter is kind of building a structure, and so I feel like summarizing the whole thing is a little tough. But he starts by setting out what he believes the state of nature to be. And that's the beginning point for where you can set up a sort of a properly functioning civil society.
Right. And so I have state of nature equals state of perfect freedom that all people are naturally in to enact their will to their own accord. Mm-hmm. And then he quotes a dude named Hooker. He quotes this guy a lot and he uses this as evidence for why we should show mutual love to everyone because of empathy. Yes. But more importantly, a state of nature, perfect freedom. And he makes some interesting points in the end. This is jumping a little bit, but it has to do with the state of nature. He's making this point of how even rulers are, an absolute ruler is essentially in the state of nature. Right. Because it's the idea that you're only out of the state of nature when you have a judge that can sort of judge you, essentially. So if you don't have any judge that's agreed upon, whether you're in like a consented society, as he discusses, then you are ostensibly in the state of nature.
Right. So a question that I had as I was reading it, just that came up in my mind, is what do you think about the state of nature being a state of equality amongst people? Because I can get on board with the idea that people are all born at a state of equal freedom and an equal level of rights and sort of ownership and things like that. Where I get a little bit hung up is the idea that people are not born technically equal. Some people are taller than others, some people are stronger than others, some people are smarter than others, although that's controversial. But people look different, they have different ability, like there's all sorts of differences. And so I would say that equality as this is almost not the state of nature.
Yeah, I think he's being very specific when he talks about equality, when he
Right.
just says that everybody has it when you're not in a civil society, which ostensibly it seems to mean you're in the state of nature.
Right.
It means that you're acting, and again, that's why I defined it as a state of perfect freedom that all people are naturally in to enact their will to
Right.
their own accord.
That
is it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so that's why, yes, and he actually makes a point about this of like, yes, of course, there's differences between all of us, but it's this idea that you can act your will to your own accord. Everybody is equally able to do that
Right.
when they're in the state of nature.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And again, I'm getting a little bit ahead, but it's like I think he sort of answers a lot of my questions about like consent, because he's getting into the consent stuff about, towards the end, because that's essentially how he's saying the most perfect political system is going to be when everybody peacefully consents to like organize. He does this on the back of defining that it's really you're only able to do this if you have the ability to reason.
Right.
So, and we can get into that, but I think that's a very important thing that is a part of all of this. Also, is that when he's saying man in this case, he's really saying a person that's able to reason.
Yes.
And he makes a distinct to other people like the insane or those with I guess you could say diminished mental capabilities. Babies. Well, and kids. I mean, he's making a lot of points about children. They're not able to reason until they reach some threshold.
Until they are.
Where
right.
then, and then they are, and then they're no longer under the volition of, in his definition, the father.
Right.
And the mother. He also makes, I think, more credence to the fact that the mother has a role to play, too.
Right.
More than might be expected for that time.
Mm-hmm.
So another sort of definition I think is worth making is the law of nature, as he defines it. Mm-hmm. And it's no one ought to harm another in his life, healthy liberty, healthy liberty or possessions. Mm-hmm. And so this is just a quote: "For man being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker, all the servants of one sovereign master sent into the world by his order and about his business, they are his property, whose workmanship they are made to last during his, not one another's pleasure." Mm-hmm. So, and this is why he's saying, like, once you break that law, then you ostensibly allow other people to punish you.
Right.
For that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, the idea that if you kill somebody, then you've essentially broken the law of nature, and now you are able to be killed because of that. So transgressing the law of nature means they aren't living by reason and common equality. And again, he puts in this thing of reason. Reason's very important here.
Yes. That's actually why it reads like Ayn Rand to me, because that's her whole basis also.
Right. And so we all have a duty to uphold this law, he says, too, and punish any transgression of the law of nature. Mm-hmm. And so civil government, he says, is in place to remedy inconveniences of the state of nature, where self-love makes people not want punishment and revenge makes people carry retribution too far.
Right. I mean, that paragraph about the civil government being the remedy for the inconveniences of the state of nature is a really interesting paragraph. What does it say? I easily grant that civil government is the proper remedy for the inconveniences of the state of nature, which must certainly be great, where men may be judges in their own case. Because he's talking about how people will argue that if men are free, then they're also free to just sort of in a biased way argue for themselves and their friends sort of unjustly against other people. Anyway, and so where was I? Oh, so where men may be judges in their own case, since it is easy to be imagined that he who was so unjust as to do his brother injury will scarce be so unjust to condemn himself for it. Like, if you've already committed a crime, why would you not keep committing crimes to get yourself off for it or something like that?
Right.
But I shall desire those who make this objection to remember that absolute monarchs are but men, and if government is to be the remedy for those evils, which necessarily follows from men being judges in their own cases, and the state of nature is therefore not to be endured, I desire to know what kind of government that is, and how much better it is than the state of nature, where one man commanding a multitude has the liberty to be a judge in his own case, and may do to all his subjects whatever he pleases, without least liberty to any one question or control those who execute his pleasure. So it's just saying that essentially there's no way out of it, because even in an absolute monarchy, that absolute monarch is going to be the judge in his own case.
No, he's not saying. He's saying that's why it's bad, and that you should. And this is what he goes on to discuss.
Wait. That's why. What's
chapter? That? Absolute monarchies. That's why you don't want that.
Wait. What?
Absolute monarchies are bad because it's not right for one person to be the judge of everybody and themselves.
Right. That's what I'm saying. That even in an absolute monarchy, the monarch ends up being the judge of his own self. There isn't a way to escape the idea that somebody, the idea of imposing absolute monarchy doesn't escape the situation of somebody being a judge.
When you said there isn't a way to escape, I thought you were saying that it's inevitable that we'll have absolute monarchy. But yes, I just
No. Even in creation of a government, you set up a situation where there's somebody who is the judge of themselves, and now they control a whole bunch of people.
Even in a government?
That's what he...
What do you... No, he said in an absolute monarch government, but not in any type of government. He's not saying that, because he goes on to discuss how what you need is a government where nobody is above the law, and that you have judges. Yes.
Well, because he says if a government is to be a remedy for those evils, he desires to know what kind of government that is, because where one man commands a multitude, he has the liberty to judge himself.
You skipped over stuff, though. Again,
I was trying to summarize it.
Yeah, but by summarizing it, you're like I think we're just misreading what he's saying.
Maybe
he's saying, like, I wish somebody would tell me this because this is obviously bad. But he does go on to answer that question. So that's why I think we're missing sort of an important point, because, again, in chapters 8, he's discussing the beginning of political society. And in that, he's basically saying that it's the consent of a group, and a group can consent to have an absolute monarch. And then he gives all these examples of really when people consent to do that. Right. And he uses the Bible as examples, as you've kind of used. Right. It's often to protect against an outside aggressor, where people will basically appoint somebody to be the legion head of an army, and then go out and fight an aggressor. But it becomes an issue then if people forget that the actual beginnings of government are when you have a group of people consenting to some sort of civil doctrine. And the best type of civil doctrine is one where nobody is above the law. So absolute monarchies, he's often coming back to saying that this is bad because of what you just said. Because, and then this is why, as I already said, that you're essentially, when you have an absolute monarch, that monarch is in the state of nature because they're free to enact their will to their own accord. And that's bad. Then they're essentially not in the civil society. And that's not right. So you need a society, and this is why, again, we have to remember that he's writing this at the time that the constitutional monarchy was being instituted,
right,
which was basically saying that this king is not above parliamentary law,
right,
and that you have a group of individuals that are also reigning over the king themselves, king and queen themselves,
right.
So that's why I think we must be missing something. I think he's doing a rhetorical device there, because that's definitely not what he's saying, that there's no answer to that question.
But yeah, I understand what you're saying. I don't think that you're wrong. I think I'm reading it slightly differently than you are.
Yeah. Because, this is the problem, is because they have such long sentences, it can be easy to think that he's referring to one thing.
Right.
Like in that sentence, I easily grant that civil government is the proper remedy for the inconveniences of the state of nature, which must certainly be great, where men may be judges in their own case. There he's talking about in the state of nature, not in civil government.
Yeah.
Yes, we agree on that.
He's granting that civil government addresses that problem of men being judges in their own case.
Yes. And then he goes on to talk about absolute monarchs.
Right. I think it's
saying,
the absolute monarch.
I desire to know what kind of government that is, sort of saying that that's not a government by what he's sort of talking about. He's saying, and in the state of nature is there, where is it? To remember that I shall desire those who make this objection to remember that absolute monarchs are but men.
Right.
And if government is to be the remedy of those evils, the evils of men, which necessarily follow from men being judges in their own cases, this is the evil, is when men are judges of their own cases, right? And the state of nature is therefore not endured. I desire to know what kind of government that is. Because he's essentially saying that's not a government. You're in the state of nature when men are see? Yes. And how much better is that than the state of nature? Because he's saying it basically is. That's how I'm reading it. Where one man commanding a multitude.
You're reading it as he's suggesting that it isn't actually a government. Yes, I desire to know what kind of government that is.
Exactly.
Meaning, like, that isn't a government at all.
Exactly. He's being cheeky.
Okay.
No, and this is
I read it as a question, like I was saying, like, can you think of a type of government that fulfills this problem?
No. I mean, but this is the, I think, difficulty of Locke is he's a little bit cheeky, and I mean that's very evident in the first treatise too. Of like, he's being very like kind of like, look at this guy, he's an idiot kind of thing. But he does it in that sort of English way where it's a little bit sarcastic. I mean, that's really what he's being. I think he's being sarcastic there. Right. So, yeah, okay, all right.
I think your reading makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and again, the only reason I feel like, because I think I probably glossed over that, although I did mark some parts on that. But it's just, if you read the rest of it, everything that he's saying is to that line. And that's what, again, I'll say it a third time. He makes an explicit point in like chapter 7 or something about how absolute monarchs are essentially in the state of nature, and this is why they're
Well, he also makes that point in this chapter.
Yes, he does. But he explicitly talks about it in the other ones too.
Right, because he's got the thing about princes all being in the state of nature.
Right. Yes, exactly. Maybe it was this chapter. I might have forgotten.
Yeah. Anyway, your reading sounds good to me.
Part of that out? I don't know.
Why would you take it? No, it's fine. I think
it's just.
I think you're right. I think the way you're reading it makes more sense than the way I was.
It's more of just. Okay. All right. I just hope we don't.
I think the beginning was weird because I think you thought I was saying something very different than what I ended up saying.
No, I thought that you were saying is that he was saying absolute monarchs are inevitable, and that's definitely not what he's saying. Okay. But
no, I thought he was saying that no type of government addresses the problem.
Right.
Ultimately.
Which would mean that they're inevitable because you're always going to have
Right.
We went over this. Yeah. Anyway, moving on.
All right, war.
Yeah. War. Well, yeah. So what'd you think of that? I think I have state of war equals a state of enmity and destruction.
Right. What I thought was interesting about it, with respect to the Rose Wilder Lane reading, was that he addresses war on a individual person-to-person level. And so for him, war, the definition of war actually just has to do with the interaction between, at a minimum, two people. So two people can actually be at war from his perspective.
Right.
Versus Rose Wilder Lane, only governments.
Right. Well, and actually, he even sort of talks about how, because it seems like Rose Wilder Lane and maybe even other people were kind of saying that government's ultimately about enacting like force, and that's why they'll always succumb to war because of that. But he actually has government's chief function is to protect property, which I thought, I mean, again, I'm jumping ahead, but I thought that was kind of interesting. And we've sort of talked about this, how you can really see the English system looks like that, and the American system has inherited that. I mean, even now you have the Suez Canal stuff by the Houthi rebels. You know, they're starting to basically fight ships in the Suez Canal, and so now what's the U.S. and a coalition of governments doing is they're going to fight them to.
I don't know anything about this.
This is a very new development. No, it's a very new development, and it has the capacity to sort of be a big deal. Or it is a big deal, but it has the capacity to paralyze a lot of trade, because now ships have to go around the Horn of Africa if they want to get to Europe and elsewhere. Anyway, but that's an example of how governments are protecting property.
Right.
Yeah. And the whole pirate stuff in the 18th century and everything by the English Navy, I mean, they were basically fighting to prevent the stealing of property by all of these rogue entities. But yeah, no, that is a good point, though, that he's sort of saying that two people can be at war. And you're right, because that's all war is a state of enmity and destruction. And therefore declaring by word or action not a passionate and hasty, but a sedate, settled design upon another man's life puts him in a state of war with him against whom he has declared such an intention, and so has exposed his life to the other's power to be taken away from him, or anyone that joins with him in defense and espouses his quarrel. For by the fundamental law of nature, man being to be preserved as much as possible when all cannot be preserved, the safety of the innocent is to be preferred. And one may destroy a man who makes war upon him or has discovered an enmity to his being for the same reason that he may kill a wolf or lion, because such men are not under the ties of the common law of reason. So he's sort of saying, like, any it almost sounds like if you enact war, you're not going by the law of reason. Anybody that's reasonable would not actually go to war. Which
is actually similar to what Rose Wilder Lane says. There's no individual person who sort of acting under their own reason and well-being would want to go to war. It would be a terrible idea.
Yeah, it's interesting. But, you know, I'm sure if we could think of some examples where it gets a little bit tricky to say that, you know, if you go to war, potentially you have reason. But I guess you would say that the whoever was the first offender, but figuring out who the first offender can be tricky, you know? Because essentially it's whoever the first offender is the one that's being unreasonable.
Yes.
It sounds
they
like
started
saying,
it.
Right. But, I mean, we have plenty of examples of, you know, people disputing.
You mean it's not always abundantly clear who the aggressor is?
That is, believe it or not, Antushka. That's what I'm saying.
That's crazy.
I know.
Right.
Yeah. Anything else on that state of war stuff? Let's see.
I wonder what he would say about because you were talking about the idea of governments protecting property versus governments enacting force. I wonder what he would say, and maybe he addresses this, and I didn't get to it. Is he talking about theoretically or what governments are actually doing?
No, I think he's talking about what governments are actually doing in saving property or protecting property.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think
so he would say like the British government's main actual thing that they do is protect property.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Protect whose property?
The constituents of that society.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because he's saying also, he goes on to talk about how natural liberty of man is equal to free from any superior power and only has law of nature to contend with. But liberty of man in society is, on the other hand, to be controlled only by legislative power granted through consent.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. He has So so we got chapter 4 of slavery.
Yes.
Dare we discuss this?
Wait, why? Is it bad?
No, I don't know. You just got to be careful.
Do you? I don't know. What do you think is bad? What do you think you have to be careful about?
No, it's just,
it's not joking. Like you wrote this.
No, I know. I'm just joking. So in Locke's definition, slaves are those who the master has an ability to kill.
Right.
And this is kind of interesting because he's saying, and thus in Locke's opinion, slaves apparently should kill themselves if they can't escape captivity. That was what I took from paragraph 22.
Interesting.
Yeah. I could read it if you want.
Sure.
You can tell me what you think. Liberty for everyone to do what he lists, to live as he pleases, and not to be tied by any laws. But freedom of men under government is to having a standing rule to live by, common to everyone of that society and made by the legislative power erected in it. Actually, I don't know if this is where. That's not where he talks about it. Yes. Okay, so it's in 23. I just wrote it down. Let me just read paragraph 23. This freedom from absolute arbitrary power is so necessary to and closely joined with a man's preservation that he cannot part with it, but by what forfeits his preservation and life together. For a man, not having the power of his own life, cannot, by compact or his own consent, enslave himself to anyone, nor put himself under the absolute arbitrary power of another to take away his life when he pleases. Nobody can give more power than he has himself, and he that cannot take away his own life cannot give another power over it. Indeed, having, by his fault, forfeited his own life by some act that deserves death, he too, whom he has forfeited it, may, when he has him in his power, delay to take it and make use of him to his own service. And he does him no injury by it. For whatever he finds the hardship of his slavery outweighs the value of his life, this is where it is. For whenever he finds the hardship of his slavery outweigh the value of his life, 'tis in his power, by resisting the will of his master, to draw on himself the death he desires. Mm-hmm. So that's where he's saying it. Yeah,
I don't think it's saying he should kill himself. I'm saying that it's saying he has killed himself, right?
Well, he's saying that he'll probably desire death, but by
enslaving himself, he's shown that he desires death.
Yeah, he's forfeited his own life.
Right.
By some act that deserves death. He to whom he has forfeited it may when he... Yeah, so... to this perfect condition of slavery, which is nothing else but the state of war continued between a lawful conqueror and a captive. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, it
really looks on the slave with disdain.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would
Sorry,
say so.
What were you saying to you?
No, I mean, and that's, I almost wish that he would talk about, because I mean, while he was writing, the slave trade was going on, you know what I mean?
Right.
But he doesn't really make reference to that explicitly.
Right. I mean, he might say that those people aren't really slaves also.
I think he basically says, like I said, a slave is just anybody whose master has the ability to kill them. If somebody has the power to kill you, then you are their
I don't
slave.
know if it's just power, because it's not like, are we... Well, because we could all, in theory, kill each other. Like, we're not slaves to each other or to anybody who owns a gun or something like that, necessarily.
But it's for a man not having the power of his own life, cannot by compact or his own consent enslave himself to anyone, nor put himself under the absolute arbitrary power of another to take away his life when he pleases.
I think life here also has to do with will. I think there's kind of a conflation of ideas happening.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very sort of confusing paragraph, honestly.
Because the way I read it, at least initially, was something like, also, people who still have the power of their will haven't really enslaved themselves. There's a line, and I think it's in here. Let me see if I can find it, where it says somebody isn't a slave if they have... There's something else. Hang on. Or maybe it's in a different section, but
yeah, so it's a slave is somebody that's under absolute, arbitrary, and despotical power. Right. He sort of says it in the negative because in the last
that absolute power is where it's like, this is where I would like to ask him what he means. Do you mean that they literally can make no choices at all?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I say that has the ability to kill is sort of an easy way. Because he says, I confess we find among the Jews, as well as other nations, that men did sell themselves, but 'tis plain that this was only drudgery, not slavery. For it is evident the person sold was not under an absolute, arbitrary, despotical power. So there he's saying it in the negative, but he's basically saying slavery is when you're under absolute, arbitrary, despotical power. For the master could not have power to kill him. So that's why I was saying... at any time, whom at a certain time... Right, but this is
what, under drudgery.
No. But he's saying that these people weren't slaves because the master didn't have the power to kill them at any time.
And this is what... does he mean power or right? Because lots of people have the power to kill each other.
He said despotical power.
But
so he's not bringing right in.
Is every like child in the world a slave to every adult?
No, because he sort of makes that point in the family section. He distinguishes between slaves and servants and family, right?
Right, but
so he obviously thinks
I have the power to kill like a baby in India, but that doesn't make them a slave.
Right. Well, first off, I think inevitably, it's just worth saying that he's saying that I think he is kind of coming out saying that slavery is bad. Because he's saying that is essentially putting you in a state of war. Yeah. I'm just saying that because that's also what he doesn't explicitly say that, but I feel like he's basically saying that because it's this idea that nobody should have the absolute power over somebody else
But when he's talking about the Jews, he's actually talking about a right. Because in the Bible, it's talking about what you are allowed and not allowed to do with your slave, not what you physically, technically can do.
No, but that's why he's saying they're not actually slaves. Because, again, I'll read it again. For it is evident the person sold was not under an absolute, arbitrary, despotical power. For the master could not have power to kill him at any time, whom at a certain time he was obliged to let go free out of his service. And the master of such a servant was so far from having an arbitrary power over his life that he could not, at pleasure, so much as maim him, but the loss of an eye or tooth set him free.
Yeah. Now,
so that's the point.
Just as an aside, this is only about Hebrew slaves. This in the Bible, it actually specifies that any other slave you can do whatever the hell you want with. Them. Only Hebrew slaves.
Yes, exactly. Yes,
but
it's true.
But that really doesn't. That's neither here nor there.
Because he said among the Jews. I mean, he does say that. He says among the Jews, right? Which is essentially talking about the Hebrew slaves,
right? As well, among the Jews as well as other nations, men sold themselves. but it's only into drudgery. You can only sell yourself into drudgery. You can't sell yourself into slavery.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
I mean, like, it's the whole thing, like, how could you consent to being a slave? That doesn't make any sense.
Right. Well, and again, I think it's just the slave is somebody that is having the law of nature transgressed against them. And I think that's why, he again saying this freedom from absolute arbitrary power is so necessary to and closely joined with man's preservation that he cannot part with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, that he can. I think it's cannot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Should we get on the property?
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, yeah. Because, that was the whole reason we got on this whole thing, so we should probably spend some time on it.
Yeah, sure.
Right. Although, I do think we've essentially... did you have anything else to say on that? I don't know.
No, I think it's... I wish that he'd been a little bit more explicit, like you were saying, like gone a little bit more into detail. I feel like the section's a little too short, and it's a little unclear.
Yeah, and that's what... I guess that's what I was saying, is I feel like he's coming up with a reason for why slavery is bad, but he doesn't quite go far enough. And maybe that's just because he was writing in a time where, I
read it as like slavery is the ultimate bad. Slavery is death. Right. Like they are tantamount.
Right. And and that the perfect condition of slavery, which is nothing else but the state of war, continued between a lawful conqueror and a captive. Yeah. For if one's compact enter between them and make an agreement for limited power on the one side and obedience on the other, the state of war and slavery ceases as long as the compact endures. So actually that just answers your question. You can have consented slavery, it sounds like, if you consent that the person will have absolute power over you.
Right.
Well, wait. Oh, no, for a limited power. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's limited power. For if one's compact enter between them and make an agreement for a limited power on one side and obedience on the other, the state of war and slavery ceases, as long as the compact endures. For, as has been said, no man can, by agreement, pass over to another that which he hath not in himself a power over his own life.
Right.
Yeah. So you can't consent to slavery, yeah.
Because, like, your life force you don't actually have control of that.
Right. Or at least you don't have control to pass it over. Yeah.
I think that there's a confusion about killing, and this is what I was asking before. I think ability to and right to are different ideas, and I feel like we're kind of, it's unclear to me where he is here.
Yeah, well, so ability to, I think a right to comes into, you bring into like civil society into that.
Right, because he was talking about that earlier in the earlier chapters about having a right to kill somebody who aggresses against you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in conclusion, slavery's bad, okay?
Yes, very.
All right. So.
All right, property.
Property. So, it's, again, I think he's building off of the Adam idea again that, God gave Adam the dominion over the world.
Right.
And so everybody has the ability to, and this dominion is over the, I guess what he calls common property. What is he? Yeah.
God gave the earth as common property to all humans.
Yes. But once you do some manipulation of that, that's when it becomes private property.
Oh, as an interesting aside, I was reading a bit in the Old Testament this week, and there's a Hebrew translation that I'm reading that the translator was saying that the word Adam is confusing. It's not a name, but everybody treats it that way.
Oh, that is.
It's a conjugation for humankind.
Ah, well, that's
cool. So
there
are certain Jewish traditions that suggest that Adam is just an archetypal description for the beginning of humans. Adam isn't just one guy.
But what about Eve?
Yeah, great question. I don't know. It didn't. It should have had a note about that. It didn't have a footnote about that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, but yeah, I'd certainly like to read it like that. And yeah, so, and you had made this point before, and I think this is probably the most common definition of property is basically once you, for instance, like an acorn, he uses acorns as an example.
Once you grab it, say it's mine.
Once you grab it, now it's yours.
Right, because your labor. You moved your arm, and you worked really hard, and you closed your fingers around it, and you learned. It was really hard to learn that as a baby, so you've put your hard work into it.
It's true. So yeah, so that's what property is. So that's pretty
easy. Easy peasy,
pretty
done.
Easy. You know, we should have no issue with this at all.
It's like whatever you lick. So the whole principle of licking something, it's the same deal, right?
Yeah,
I called
I think so. Yeah. Oh, okay. So he gets into some pretty interesting points, though, when money comes into because basically he's saying, like, before you had the creation of money, nobody would really be able to collect more property than they could use themselves, and because they couldn't stow away like a bunch of stuff. But then once you had money into creation, this sort of destroyed the rule of property. So I'm trying to find where he defined the rule of property.
He does it a few different times. Do you mean the labor thing?
Yeah, I guess maybe that's it.
Like 27, he has one definition of it.
Yeah. Do you want to read it?
Sure. Through the earth and all inferior creatures, though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. So you own yourself. You are your own property. That's the starting point. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatever then he removes out of the state of nature, whatever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with and joined it to something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property, it being by him removed from the common state nature hath placed it in.
Right.
It hath by this labor something annexed to it that excludes the common right of other men. Should I keep going? I mean, I think the point is made, right?
Well, no, it was, but I think that's true. So that's sort of like a general definition. But he also sort of goes on to discuss how it's actually not ethical to take more.
Yes.
Than you want. I feel like that's part of the rule of property too. But I don't know where he sort of exactly defines
but he's talking about wasting. So, as much as anyone can make use of to any advantage of life before it spoils, so much he may by his labor fix a property in.
Right.
So that's before whatever is beyond this is more than his share and belongs to others. Right. Nothing was made by God for man to spoil or destroy. That's,
I think, more chiefly what the rule of property is, because then he goes on in paragraph 36 towards the end. He says, "This I dare boldly affirm, that the same rule of property, that every man should have as much as he could make use of, would hold still in the world, without straitening anybody, since there is land enough in the world to suffice double the inhabitants, had not the invention of money and the tacit agreement of men to put a value on it, introduced, by consent, larger possessions and a right to them, which how it has done, I shall by and by show more at large." Yeah, so this is certain that in the beginning, before the desire of having more than men needed had altered the intrinsic value of things, which depends only on their usefulness to life of man, or men had agreed that a little piece of yellow metal, which would keep without wasting or decay, right, should be worth a great piece of flesh or a whole heap of corn. Though men had a right to appropriate by their labor each one to himself as much of the things of nature as he could use, yet this could not be much, nor to the prejudice of others, where the same plenty was still left to those who would use the same industry. So he goes on, but the point is, money is what sort of destroyed that, because then now you could take and harbor more than you could ever use. Mm-hmm. And I just think it's interesting because this is sort of like the fundamental issue of our society. It's always that you have people that end up sequestering more resources than they actually need.
But I think his point before is interesting because it's not just about more you can ever use, because it also has to do with what you want. I don't think he's suggesting that you can't desire more and desire abundance. I think it has to do with the ability of what you are keeping to spoil rather than somebody else having access to it, which actually I would dispute with him. And
that's one. Well, that's one reason people didn't do this before money was invented.
Didn't do what?
Didn't sequester more than they could use because stuff would spoil.
Right. I mean, I bet people did. Aren't there stories
but
of like weird kings trying to make
yes. But there was a limit
and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, but there was a limit, and that's the point. It's like now once you have money into play, you have something that will never spoil and that people can sort of tuck away.
Right. But I mean, maybe
periods.
I'm misreading him or something. I would argue though that money actually allows you to have, say, like an unlimited amount of resource, in quotes, without it spoiling, and so you're not taking anything from anybody.
An unlimited amount of resource?
Well, right. We can keep creating resource as we create money, and then future money is like as money is created, there's theoretical further resource. And it's no resource is being spoiled by that. Like you were saying, it never spoils, and so nothing's being taken from anybody. It's different. It's different. Like if you have 100 ears of corn, and you just take them all, and you can only eat 3 a day or something like that, and all the rest go to waste, and everybody else starves. That's different. If you have 100 ears of corn and you have $1,000, those dollars aren't making any corn go bad.
Well, they are if other people don't have money to buy. And if there's a fixed amount of money, then it is sort of taking away.
Well, that's why money has to be in concert with capital goods. Like
yes,
that's where inflation and deflation.
Yeah,
happen.
I know that. But do you see his point? I think that I see your point, but I think it's sort of complicating it. I think all he's making here is he's saying that once you've abstracted away from the actual physical entity, it becomes easier to go beyond your necessary means, because that's again he's talking about the rule of property, and he begins.
I feel like I agree.
That.
It becomes easier to, but I don't think it has to be that way.
Well, he's saying that the same rule of property, that every man should have as much as he could make use of, use of, would hold still in the world if it weren't for the invention of money. That's what he's saying. So, but because you have money invented, now people can sequester more resources, money being an abstraction of resources. And especially, and we got to remember, he was living in a time too where, again, gold was still a finite commodity. Right. I mean, relatively finite, right? They were mining more, but, it wasn't until the New World. Yeah. I mean, the New World discovery actually kind of messed up a little bit of the gold reserves, because all of a sudden you have much more gold. But people have always been trying to sequester whatever the money resource it is, whether it was gold, silver, or just American dollars in this case. And yes, you have inflation, but that doesn't mean that the inflation is keeping pace with the sequestration of it, right?
No, it's definitely not. I mean, inflation would mean it's not keeping pace.
Right. Well, or deflation or whatever. I mean, in any case, I think you could say that people are constantly sequestering more than they need and also are sort of taking away from other people. And I think, yeah.
But I would argue that money does the exact opposite, and it actually allows people to more easily not take more than they need in terms of actual resource, because you don't need the physical resource in hand. You can hold the money to get it later or something like that. So if there's 100 ears of corn, you don't have to take so much right now. You can take corn as you need it.
Yes, if you have enough money to buy it. But if but now you have all of these other things that are impacting the value of that money.
Right.
So it's not as easy to just say, hey, I have like these cattle here. I have something sort of concrete here.
Right.
And let me just trade you this for that. Because now you have this other, I mean, and of course there's always value coming into play. But this is, I think, the problem with money, too, is that you have other outside forces that are determining how much it's actually valued, that are beyond just you and the person in front of you.
Right.
You have third-party people determining the value of it. And again, I'm not saying that, obviously we need money, it seems to be the case.
It seems. I mean, I think it's maybe the most important invention, like, ever.
What about fire?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, of course. But, like, without money, none of our, like, intellectual or medical advances would really happen, because people would need to be worrying so much about like cows and corn and stuff like that. Because the thing is, like, if all you have is knowledge, how do you trade that for stuff?
No, I mean, I see your point, and it's interesting because I feel like we're on the opposite side. Because in many cases on this argument, I feel like I'm the one sort of saying we need this because of society, and look at all the great things that we have in society. And I kind of agree with you. Yeah, money has allowed us to abstract. And this might even be a reason that fractional reserve banking isn't the worst thing, because again, it's you're able to sort of project in the future that you will have a certain amount of wealth, but you don't necessarily have it now. It's like almost an optimistic thing, right? Yeah. Anyway, don't clip that. But it begs the question, and this is again why I was always asking you about the anarchy. What society does it look like when you're in anarchy? In my opinion, it looks like the hunter-gatherer sort of plain society, like the Native Americans were before.
But I don't think that money has to be federal bills. I feel like this is the thing: is I see money at its baseline is essentially somebody signing off, like, this guy's good for the value.
Yes.
It's just money is reputation, essentially.
Yes.
And you're going to have that. You're going to have that in any society. You don't need it to be federal. But
this is, again, when you say society, I think Locke would agree. Once you have a society, you have a government, and which is why government ultimately ends up controlling the currency in some way.
Once you have a society, you have government. Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
I mean, well, and maybe we should. I don't know if we should move, because we've been going a while.
Yeah.
And I think we'll come back to this money idea, because I think it's a good one. Labor adds most of the value to property. That was an interesting point. Most of the value to property.
What? What does he mean by that?
So he says, this is paragraph 40.
Right.
So I'm just trying to see that the property of labor should be able to overbalance the community of land. For 'tis labor indeed that puts the difference of value on everything. And let anyone consider what the difference is between an acre of land planted with tobacco or sugar, sown with wheat or barley, blah, blah, blah. That will find that the improvements of labor makes the far greater part of the value. I think it will be put a very modest computation to say that of the products of the earth useful of the life of man are the effects of labor. Nay, if we will rightly estimate things as they come to our use, and cast up the several expenses about them, what in them is purely owing to nature, and what to labor, we shall find that most of them, 99 out of 100, are wholly to be put on the account of labor.
So what can you sum it up in what you'd say that means?
Yeah, I already said labor adds most of the value.
But what does that mean? So
if
like
you have
corn and you have tobacco, and if corn takes more work to plant than tobacco, corn is more valuable.
Then it'll be, yes, exactly.
Yeah, I mean I disagree 100%.
Okay. Why?
I think labor by itself has no value, other than to the laborer.
What is value? Value
is does somebody want it?
Yes.
Do I want it? Do you want it? So value is just what.
It's not just that. That's.
I think it is just that.
Well, there's a demand aspect, but there's also a supply aspect, which gives it a little bit, and this is, again, supply is going to be,
right.
That's where labor comes in, right? Because you're going to be able to supply more if it uses less labor. But if it's more labor,
right? But you can have if you have no demand, yeah, of course, demand and supply interact. But demand, like the value of something, is an internal, like it's whatever it is you value it at. Like value. From my perspective, it's just 100% subjective, right. And it has to do with how much you want it. And so if somebody digs a hole...
It's not 100% subjective. It's not. We just discussed how value is intrinsically connected to supply and demand, and I just told you how labor fits into that.
Right, but if you but if you dig a hole, it's not worth anything. You can work all day long. You can work as hard as you want on digging, and it's not worth anything to anybody. Unless somebody wants you to dig a hole and it has value to somebody. If somebody wants it, then it has value. If nobody wants it, it has no value.
Yeah, yes, but if of that value, labor, of even just the little value it might have, labor makes up most of it. That's what he's saying.
But I think we're conflating price and value.
Well, maybe you are.
So something is going to cost more if it takes more labor, for sure. But that doesn't mean it's more valuable.
Sure. I mean, yes, but again, let's stick with value here, right? Which we've said is subjective and is also connected to, again, supply and demand.
Well, so the meeting of supply and demand is price. That's not value.
The meaning of supply and demand is price. Sure.
Is cost.
Well,
yeah. So value is the demand and supply is the amount. And then how much it costs is where those things meet.
Okay. But if something is more difficult to make, right, there's going to be demand for it.
Why?
Which is where... Well, there'll be more demand than something that's easy to make.
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think so. I've never wanted something more because it's hard to make.
No, but it's the idea that there will be more of it. If it's easy to make, there will be more of that thing.
So it'll be cheaper.
Well, you're the one that didn't want to bring cost into it.
No, I'm saying I would never value something based on how hard it is to make.
I'm just saying that there will be less of it if it's easier to make. I mean, more of it, sorry, if it's easier to make.
Right. But why does supply affect value? So actually, I don't think supply affects value. Why does supply
affect value? I just told you why. Because if things are easy to make, if you have two things that are, let's say, the same, we've got two watches, right? And one watch is much easier to make, takes less time to make, and somebody's just making a bunch of watches, you're going to have more of the watch that requires less labor.
I mean, I think if somebody knows that there's only 10 of some watch in the world and that is valuable to them, I get it. But there's no intrinsic value to scarcity.
Well, there's no intrinsic value to anything.
Exactly.
You could
That's
say.
exactly
Yes,
my point.
But we're not getting anywhere then. And this is why value is relative, fine, but value exists, whether it's relative or absolute.
I agree
right?
with that. Yeah.
But that's what I'm giving you this example where you have a relative value, and within this sample, you have two different types of labor. And in the one that takes more labor, you have it being more valuable. And hence, more labor is more value. That's his whole point.
I think it's possible in any given situation, but I don't think that's
you're
a
just
law.
Being pedantic.
What?
Yeah, well, that's fine. I think you're being pedantic.
What is it you don't agree with? Because I actually don't understand what you're saying.
I'm saying that again. Let's take, because we agreed it's difficult to value things, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I'm saying let's take an item that is the same, essentially, but there's going to be some difference between the two, where you have one that takes more labor, and so you only have like one or two or three of them, and then you have another type of watch where you have like 50 of them.
Right.
The one that takes more labor, thus, is going to have more value because there's fewer of them. That's where the demand hits
if
in.
I abstract your argument, let me know if I'm right on it. Are you saying that as supply decreases, value increases?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just don't agree with that. I don't think that's right. I think if we go back to the starting point of value being subjective, that will be different for every person. And so there isn't a way to abstract value in that way. There isn't a way to add it to your supply-demand curve because it's subjective.
Yeah. Well, I think it's in a practical setting. I think you see this all over the place. And it's even just like, I was just reading an article today about like the luxury brands people are starting to get mad at them because they're basically burning off inventory to create less supply and thus more demand. Right. And, yeah.
Yeah. I think that for a lot of people, scarcity has some kind of cachet. And so I think that yes, you can play on people's psychology. I'm not saying that you can't say that.
Well, no,
people
we're saying
tend
it's
to
all psychology, though. That's the point. Is value is all psychology, as
exactly.
We sort of,
right.
Yes.
Right. So I agree with the idea that you can play on people's psychology, and you can bet that if you can develop a sense of scarcity, people will think it's more valuable, and that is exactly what it means to them. Because I would say it's subjective. That's true, and I think good people who are good at marketing are good at sort of manipulating that kind of stuff. I think in terms of adding it to our supply-demand curve, I don't think value is quantifiable at all. I think it is manipulatable. On the other hand, if we go back to labor, I think that labor by itself has no value other than to the laborer. Because the laborer has expended calories.
Well, maybe that's what he's saying then, For 'tis labor indeed that puts the difference of value on everything. And let anyone consider what to... Yeah, we already said that.
Right.
That the improvement of labor makes the far greater part of the value. Because in some sense, I do feel like he's writing all of this from the POV of the laborer.
Right.
But I will say, honestly, as I was saying this, and I'm surprised you didn't make this note, it's like somebody could just artificially make a watch, even though it takes less time to make. They could just not make that many of them, right? And thus you have a smaller demand, right? That's your point, I think, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not the labor side of things.
Yes. And so that's why maybe he's talking about in a perfect system.
Right.
In theory, you know what I mean? Okay.
I don't know.
No, but I think you've gotten me more on your side, Mr. Antushka.
Yeah. I feel like this episode has been a slog of a lot of misunderstandings that I feel like we've come out at pretty well on all of them, I think. At least I think we understand each other, I think. I hope.
Yeah. No, I think so. There cannot be a clear demonstration of anything, this talking about the labor value thing, then several nations of the Americans are of this, who are rich in land and poor in all the comforts of life, whom nature having furnished as liberally as any other people, with the materials of plenty, yet for want of improving it by labor, have not 1/100th part of the conveniences we enjoy, and a king of a large and fruitful territory there feeds, lodges, and is clad worse than a day laborer in England.
Right.
So that's why I wonder if he's talking about a little bit closer to reality than what we're talking about. You know what I mean?
Right.
And
this land is uncultivated. It's all this untapped resource that could be cultivated and made way more productive than it is.
And the way that you do that is by labor.
Right.
You know?
Sure.
And
or you have robots do it, but yes.
Well, yeah, but you have to labor to make the robots, you know?
Yeah.
That's like labor's going to come into it at some point.
Yep.
And I think that's his kind of ultimate point when he says that value is 99 out of 100% of labor is 99% of the value of something.
Right. I think this is the thing is like we're not talking to him, and it's kind of the thing in the slavery where I was wondering if he was talking about rights or ability. I think maybe he's using the word value differently than we are, or like less specifically or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I'm just trying to see if he ever does define value, because I mean that would sort of help us all. How much labor makes the far greatest part of value of things we enjoy in this world? So he says, the one of these being the food and raiment which unassisted nature furnishes us with, the other provisions which our industry and pains prepare for us, which how much they exceed the other in value, when anyone hath computed, he will then see how much labor makes the far greatest part of the value of things we enjoy in this world. And the ground which produces the materials is scarce to be reckoned in as any or as most, but a very small part of it, so little that even amongst us land that is left wholly to nature, that hath no improvement of pasturage, blah, blah, blah. Okay.
I mean, there's a sense in which I get what he's saying, or I'm sympathetic to, you know, like if we're all living out in the woods and then somebody clears out a bunch of trees and plants a field of tomatoes and now we can all eat tomatoes, we could be like, oh man, that was through all your hard work and now we have all this food. And your hard work, you know, is really great, and we really appreciate it. And so I can see where he's putting the value on labor, but that's very directed labor seeking a very particular outcome.
I think it must be just the difference in how he's defining value versus how you are.
Yeah, maybe.
It's just I don't know where he explicitly defines value.
Because the tobacco sugar example was a weird one to me.
Well, and it's like value being, it's like aside from like my watch example, he's talking about, again, like a resource that somebody can use to eat, right?
Right.
And by just using ingenuity and logic and everything like that, and thus laboring over the land, you're able to make it much more valuable. The same piece of land is made more valuable with the type of labor that you put into it.
Yeah.
The type of labor.
Agree.
Maybe that's
I agree. And the land is more valuable, not the labor.
Yes, the land is more valuable.
Yeah, right.
Did I say labor? Yeah.
No, you didn't. You said it right. I was being cheeky and pointing, because I think that it's different than how he's putting it. The way you put it, I agree with. I agree with you on that.
I think he is saying that the land is more valuable, though, because then he goes on to discuss how like 10 acres of like forested land that nobody's using in the Americas is less value than 1 acre used in England under like...
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
I don't know. Anyway, yeah, so... I think we are in agreement, and I think we might even agree with Locke. I certainly agree with Locke, or I see his point that he's trying to make. That is, it's how you use things and how you use that adds value to it, and the how in this is labor.
Right.
All right. Should we... Oh, yeah, here he is. And indeed, it was a foolish thing as well as dishonest to hoard up more than he could make use of.
Yep.
Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know if we've been going a while.
Yeah.
But, because then he goes, chapter 6 is all about paternal power, where he's sort of...
Right.
This is where he really goes into the law of reason and everything like that. And the law of reason governs all, and is saying how, I'm just wondering how we should do this. Can you go another 30 minutes?
Sure.
Okay. Because,
because you're itching to.
Well, I think this is important. Yeah, because, did you get to the paternal power part?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Because, so it is kind of easy to summarize. So age and reason frees a child from parental control. And so you really can't consent. This is where it's like you can't consent to a government until you have reason.
Right.
And so he makes this point in like chapter 8, I think, where he's building off of, because he finally, when he gets to chapter 8, he's talking about political society. I'm sorry, 7, he starts talking about political society, and that the first society was between man and wife, which have beginnings to that of parent and children. But sort of the ideal society is one where you have a group of individuals with reason that consent to be legislated over. And I'm just trying to see what important points. And we've already talked about this, but he discusses how slaves aren't part of civil society because they're not capable of property, basically.
Right.
And so anyway, I'm going to just skip to, I think, chapter 8. I'm just trying to see. Oh, yeah. Well, here's an example. This sort of further clarifies that one point in whatever it was, paragraph 23 or before then, paragraph 13. Paragraph 89, and wherever there are any number of men, however associated, that have no such decisive power to appeal to a higher judge, there they are still in the state of nature. And so this is the reason why absolute monarchs themselves are actually in the state of nature. Hence it is evident that absolute monarchy, which by some men is counted the only government in the world, is indeed inconsistent with civil society. He says this in paragraph 90.
Right.
And so can be no form of civil government at all.
Right.
And that's why I think he was being cheeky before. For the end of civil society being to avoid and remedy those inconveniences of the state of nature which necessarily follow from every man's being judged in his own case by setting up a known authority to which every one of that society may appeal upon any injury received or controversy that may arise. Okay, so finally, and then it's in paragraph 94 that he discusses how government, whereas government has no other end but preservation of property. Yeah, and let me just find where I could start reading that. Well, yeah, and so the beginning of political societies is chapter 8. And so he says, men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living one amongst another in a secure enjoyment of all their properties and a greater security against any that are not of it. And so that's sort of the beginnings of a civil society. This any number of men may do because it injures not the freedom of the rest. They are left as they were in the liberty of the state of nature. When any government, when any number of men have so consented to make one community or government, they are thereby presently incorporated and make one body politic, wherein the majority have a right to act and conclude the rest. And so here he's also explicitly talking about how the best is when the majority are governing. Sorry.
Right.
Antushka.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, because, you know, I mean, that's essentially what
but he's also,
is.
it's all based on consent. Because this is his whole thing is like, consent is also removable.
Right. Well, and that's why I wanted to talk to you about this, because he is placing a very important point on consent, which is what your whole point in the anarchy episodes was. It is necessary the body should move that way being the way of the majority, whether the greater force carries it, which is the consent of the majority. So it's the consent of the majority that is the ideal for this body politic.
Right. That's crazy.
So that's crazy to you. Okay.
Yeah.
Why is that crazy?
Because like the consent of the majority consented to the Holocaust.
Did they? I think we talked about this. Is that the Holocaust wasn't like voted upon.
Okay, fine.
It was
the majority
kept secret.
consented to electing Adolf Hitler.
Yes, that's true.
So like the majority could consent to kill the minority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very true.
And I'm not even saying that they would, but that's conceivably pretty possible.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it is, you raise good points. Yeah.
Or not even, like, whatever. They could consent to, like, tax the minority at, 50 times the rate or something crazy,
Yeah. And I think this is why the point of reason is so important in his sort of discussion.
Right.
And it is this, it's maybe the fundamental thing that we have to contend with when we're trying to form a society. And it is, I guess, controversial to say, but it's like we all have different levels of reasoning capabilities. Right. And maybe you could argue that you want the majority to have sway when it is a population of reasonable individuals. But if you have a majority of individuals who, are not reasonable, aren't using reason and are going off of emotion, right? Then that's when you have the issues potentially.
What I don't understand is it's not really the way we operate in life. Like, if you have a problem, like if you want to go see a doctor or something like that, you're not usually seeking majority opinion. You're seeking like expert opinion or something like that. And then expert is actually a minority. You don't go around asking everybody, is this tumor cancerous?
It depends, because you might actually say that it is if you go to two doctors.
But you go to so you go to two doctors. So you go to a minority to seek a majority or something like that. Because a doctor is a way minority. Yes. Most people aren't doctors by a huge amount.
Yes, but it just depends on what perspective you're looking at majority. And most doctors you go to are going to be diagnosing things based off of what a majority of the doctors agree upon, and this is... Is that actually true? Yes, because this is how guidelines are made, is you have a committee that meets, and
that's
then they
not
decide.
A majority of doctors.
No, but I'm telling you where the majority comes in.
I see.
You have a committee of experts about something that meet, and then they vote, and the majority that's how it's decided. The majority of that committee decides what the guidelines are going to be. And actually, we had a professor come in and discuss this, how he actually wishes that you would be able to actually publish the minority opinions, but actually they just do it of the majority is just what's published. But that's, again, it's just what level of democracy are you looking at? And yes, of course, you can find, I mean, we've talked about this. You can sort of define a minority, a majority, however you want.
Right.
But in the case of getting together a committee and then having a majority of them meet there, that is an example of a majority rule. And that is, again, how guidelines are established.
Sure. But this is definitely not true in all cases. Like, I don't play music by majority rule. I feel like mechanics, maybe, like if it's a guideline thing, and if it's there's guidelines, there's experiences. I'm not saying that we never do, but I think that the way we go through life is a whole variety of different modes of decision making.
Yeah, but you kind of do, because it's like when you go and play at a bar or whatever, it's like when you're playing covers, you're kind of playing what most people like to hear. If you want to be asked back, right?
Sure. I think I think it's more complicated than that, but I take your point. I see what you're saying. You're trying to appeal to the majority of the people there, or something like that. That's true, but I don't think that my decision making might be to try and appeal to the majority, but my decision isn't based on what the majority of people think I should do, because they don't know what I should do. And in fact, if you ask most non-musicians for what you should do, they'll give you weird answers that you know is not what they mean.
Yeah, that's probably true.
I mean, it's probably the same it's probably the same with medical stuff. If somebody doesn't, this is what I was saying, like if I go ask anybody on the street, is this tumor cancerous? I'm not going to get helpful information at all.
Right. Yes. It's how you're defining the majority, and in that case, of course, if you ask a majority of doctors, hopefully they would tell you that, because they would be well trained.
Exactly.
Right? And I mean, this is where, but of course, I agree. We've talked about examples of like Semmelweis. He was in a minority opinion that you should wash your hands after you do a dissection, right? And people called him crazy. Right. And so I agree that Yes. Well, no, and I mean, I'm just trying to say, like, I agree that there are examples where minorities are very important to be taken into account.
I feel like if you want stasis, probably majority rule is a great way to do it. And if you want progress, probably it's very bad.
Yeah.
Because that same crowd is going to want to hear all the stuff they've always heard. They're going to be very hesitant to hear anything new. They're going to be like uneasy about it.
Right. And, I mean, this is where it's like minorities probably drive the changes in society. Yeah, which is what you're saying. Yeah. Yep. Hence the stasis point.
Right. So having a society that's run by majority rule, actually, this is almost in line with what he's saying about money in a weird way. It's holding the situation as it is static, or an attempt to. Because the great thing about money is it allows you to easily develop more wealth.
Yeah.
But he's talking about more than you need, so he's already coming at it from a very conservative angle. Mm-hmm. So, like, not having more than you need, and then the majority idea is, not pushing us in directions that are uncomfortable.
Well, yeah, and then I guess that's why I keep adding this important nuance that he's sort of harping on is the idea of reason.
Right.
Because if you have a reasonable majority, they're probably like you could say that the majority in the case of Semmelweis, for instance, they were not being reasonable. They weren't paying attention to evidence, right? The fact that, they were going off of dogma. And so that's why I think it's this idea of reason is a very important point that I keep harping on, because he harps on it. And if you have a reasonable group of people, they will the majority is probably going to be the correct route.
How do you get a reasonable group of people? Because I can tell you there's things that I look at and I think are reasonable and other people think are completely unreasonable.
Like this paragraph that we discussed.
Right. Or, the taxation example. I think it's reasonable to suggest that taxation is theft. I think that's like the most reasonable, easy conclusion to come to. And other people think that's nuts.
Yeah.
And so, either I am reasonable or I'm not. Like, I could be in psycho and think I'm reasonable. That is possible. And then how do we determine?
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, it's difficult. Yeah, no, I agree. But I guess it's a starting point.
Right.
And this is why, if we had time, potentially we should read his essay on human understanding, or
right.
Which is where he sort of lays down the mind and sort of his opinion of where we get reason. But I agree. I mean, he makes examples of where it's like kids don't have the ability to reason in the same way as you could say the majority do.
Right.
And also people who are insane and mentally handicapped don't have the same ability to reason as the majority do. And it's clear that we all have a spectrum of reasoning, and it gets at this very deep question, too, because that seems to mean, in Locke's definition, they have less rights. We've probably done it, right?
So I think we did it. So the labor argument, I feel like that's another one I have with it. That's another one everybody thinks I'm an idiot or something.
I think it just depends on how you define value.
Right.
I think that's what it is. You're right. I haven't thought about it as much as you, and so in this case, I'd have to think more about how I define value, and also I'd have to understand Locke's definition of value more.
That's tough. I wish I had more of an understanding of Locke's perspective to comment on it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Just to sort of put a bow on it, I think we did, but I feel like there was one. Yeah, so, and I've already kind of said this, but he says, a lot of people say monarchy, right, is the inevitable type of government, but he's sort of making the point that, no, it's actually this is just the type that people think is kind of the most, it's the best for maybe defending against people. Right. Like outside aggressors. And it's also the one that they're probably most accustomed to because this is kind of how the family is structured. But actually, what you actually have, if you look at it in greater detail, is you have a group of people consenting to somebody being the rule.
Right.
And then what you often will then have is generations pass and the monarchs forget this, that they were actually consented to be the rulers.
Right.
And then they start to enact absolute power. Right. And at that point, it sort of becomes almost incumbent upon the people who are being ruled over to remind the monarch that, oh, no, you are also, you're part of this civil society too.
You're just a dude. We can cut your head off. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. Let them eat cake.
Yeah. My last question to him would then be, how are you determining consent?
Yes, it's a good question. Yeah, because in paragraph 112 he says, and thus much may suffice to show that as far as we have any light from history, we have reason to conclude that all peaceful beginnings of government have been laid in the consent of the people.
Yep.
And then he says, I say peaceful because I shall have occasion in another place to speak of conquest, which some esteem a way of beginning of government. So he'll get that in the later part. But and then he has this last sort of interesting point about children, because he's also, some people are saying, and thus the consent of free men born under government, which only makes them members of it, being given separately in their turns, as each comes to be of age, and not in a multitude together. So he's sort of addressing this idea that, but people haven't consented to being Okay, yeah. So he sets up this proposition that all men being born under government, some or other, it is impossible any of them should ever be free and at liberty to unite together and begin a new one or ever be able to erect a lawful government because we're just born into governments.
Right.
So that's sort of what he's refuting. That's an objection.
Right.
And he's saying, well, yeah, so you're born into basically actually whatever your father is into. Your family is the first government that you're under.
Yeah.
And if your father is within whatever country and following that rule, then yes, you're under that tutelage. But really it's that you're subject to your parents first. And once you are of a reasonable age, or once you have reason, you hit the age of reason, whenever that might be, then you have the ability to move anywhere else. And,
right.
'Tis plain then by the practice of governments themselves, as well as by the law of right reason, that a child born a subject of no country or government, he is under his father's tuition authority till he comes to age of discretion, and then he is a free man at liberty, what government he will put himself under, and what body politics he will unite himself to. But, because, and then he goes on to just say, or to agree with others to begin a new one in vacuous locus in any part of the world they could find free and unpossessed. So he's saying, you can go to other commonwealths or whatever, or you can just go where land is free. And it's like, to that point, I say we've discussed this before. We live in a time where you really can't, I mean, there's no land that's unclaimed.
Right. Well, this is why I was asking earlier, do you think he's talking in theory or in practice? Because I basically agree with his principle in theory. I just don't see it in the world.
Yeah, I think he was living during a time where there was much more land.
No passports, no social security numbers.
Exactly. You could just
customs.
Could just go you could just go and disappear. And people will make the point about how Native Americans were actually here, because I think he's thinking about the New World a lot when he talks about this, unpossessed land. But they were living before the idea of property, right? They didn't think the land was something that anybody could sort of lay claim to.
I don't think it's true of all Native American groups, but yeah.
That's true. I mean,
and I think that almost all human groups have at least some proto-idea of property.
Yes.
Whether you can own land, that it's still like your
shirt. Yeah, you're right. I think I take that back. I think, but it was different in how we think about states today, right?
Yeah.
But you're right. There were, of course, territories that people inhabited,
right?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I guess but it was just easier. I mean, even then, though, you could probably go into the woods and disappear much more easily than you can now, right?
Yes.
And I don't know.
Well, because we have all this stuff. We have all these weird needs now. Like,
right.
I was just thinking about it just as we were talking. Like, you have to get your kid a social security number. If you're a parent, you have a kid, and you live under the government, you get them a social security number. And then somebody from the 1600s is like, well, why would you need a social security number? They're like, well, so I can get like tax advantage, blah blah blah, and like be tied to the city. It's like, well, why would you need any of that? What is all that good for? So I can have a passport and so I can go to another country. And it's like, well, why do you need to go to another country? You live in a giant country.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, and then I need to get I need to have electricity and plumbing, all this stuff. They didn't have any of that stuff. So from their perspective, like, we're tying ourselves down to things that we definitely don't need.
Yeah, no, and I was thinking actually at some point maybe we should read Walden.
Sure.
Thoreau sort of makes all those points in this.
Yep.
In that.
Yep.
Although that's a tough one too, because it's just very rambly, honestly.
Right. Yeah, I know. Last time I read it, I wasn't that into it.
Yeah, there's a part where he's like delineating like all the. I mean, it's interesting from one perspective, but it's also kind of boring. He's like talking about all the different types of screws he used, and everything like that. Yeah,
I mean, it's sort of funny. It's like a meditation.
Funny. Yeah. Well, the guy was by himself in the woods for 2 years,
Right.
what else are you going to do but count the screws?
Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, it's like I couldn't build a house if I needed to, you know? Maybe I could if I needed to, but it wouldn't
hard.
Be
great.
It wouldn't be a very good house, that's for sure, yeah. Okay, this is an interesting episode.
Yeah. All right.
Maybe that'll be the title. I don't know.
Yeah.
I got to think about it.
All right. Well, so long, everybody.
Yeah, I think we covered it. We probably covered this more thoroughly than any of the other ones, though.
Probably.
Which I think is good, though, because I think it is sort of a very
important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So long.
See you.